The direction of global action on climate change is at a juncture. The impending return of Donald Trump to the White House and his promise to rip up the climate-focused Inflation Reduction Act has the world watching and wondering what will happen. At the UN climate change talks in Baku, Azerbaijan, the COP29, nations are negotiating down to their final days, trying to strike an agreement on finance for developing countries to take climate action. It's proving tricky, though, the ambition of some countries tempered by the antipathy of others. And then here in Australia, work is underway about what Australia's emissions reduction targets should be for 2035, and that's causing plenty of debate already. I'm Melissa Clarke on Ngunnawal Country in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. I'm joined by the Chair of the Climate Change Authority and former Liberal New South Wales Treasurer and Energy Minister Matt Kean, who is just back from COP29 himself. Matt, how was Baku?
G'day, Mel. Baku was an experience, it's fair to say. It's an interesting country and an interesting part of the world. But what was most interesting is that 100,000 of the world's citizens descended on Baku for the world's most important climate conference, and I was lucky to be part of it. It was an extraordinary experience against the backdrop of the Trump election. There were huge amounts of people coming in there, and it was a very interesting time to be amongst world leaders and the climate world in that backdrop.
And given that, there was certainly a lot of concern that if Trump were to win back the presidency, that might see a stalling of global action on climate change. If the world's biggest economy wasn't willing to keep progressing with climate action, as Donald Trump has made it clear he doesn't particularly want to press forward in that area, that might stall global efforts. Is that the sense that you got at COP29?
Well, I certainly went to COP worried that the absence of American leadership in climate would dampen enthusiasm across the world for strong action on climate change. But when I arrived, I was surprised about the level of enthusiasm to continue on the trajectory. We met with over 20 different countries' delegations to understand what their thinking was with regard to their 2035 target and whether or not that had changed in light of the Trump victory in the United States. And it's fair to say...
Was a US delegation amongst those 20?
They were. We got to spend time with John Podesta, and who was the lead climate negotiator on behalf of the Biden administration, Rick Duke as well, his 2IC. So we spent some time with the Americans to understand their thinking. It's fair to say I think they were the most concerned about or pessimistic about action on climate change. But that certainly wasn't the case with the other delegations that we met with, or the other players that we met with on the 4 days that I was there.
Some of the Democrats in the US think that the Inflation Reduction Act, America's best effort to make progress on reducing emissions and having a focus on climate action, might be more durable than people think during a Trump presidency. What do you think?
I think that's certainly the case. I mean, the intel that I got out from the American delegation and a number of non-government and business actors from America that were over there was that they thought that the Republicans would use a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer, to use the words of Speaker Johnson. If you recall, there were 18 House Republicans that wrote a letter to the Speaker before the election of the Trump presidency requesting that they keep the IRA in place. And congressional Republicans that were elected that have benefited from IRA tax breaks, production tax credits, they have only increased. So the view was that there'll be a large number of Republicans in the Congress that will want to keep a number of the incentives in place because their communities benefit from it. And the messaging out of the Trump administration so far, or the leadership of the Republican Party, has clearly been to use a scalpel approach rather than a sledgehammer when it comes to removing parts of the IRA. But Donald Trump, it'll be a wild ride. and we'll wait and see what happens.
I was going to say there's still a fair degree of uncertainty there. Whether is there going to be a sledgehammer? Will it be a scalpel? Will it be something altogether unpredictable, which is always a possibility if Donald Trump's in the White House? So how do you go about assessing where Australia sits in this picture, or how Australia might be affected by any of those possibilities?
I think with a degree of difficulty at the moment. I mean, it's early days. We haven't seen the Trump administration sworn into office, so that'll happen late January. But we can take some messaging from what he said on the campaign trail. I mean, he's clearly said when it comes to the energy transition, he wants to drill, baby, drill. He's clearly flagged that he thought climate change was a hoax during the campaign. That said, again, they are a typical Republican sort of focus. A lot of those congressional members and Senate members that want to focus on small government and installing business confidence. Well, the surest way to rip away business confidence is to change the rules retrospectively. So I think what we saw last time with the Trump administration, they extended the safe harbour provisions, which meant that projects that were already being invested in, money that was already flowing to clean energy projects, that continued. In fact, they extended the safe harbour provisions. But if that money isn't out the door, if those projects haven't started, then I think there's a reason to be cautious.
And does that change the appetite for international investors looking at how they might be able to invest in the energy transition here in Australia? Or is that a separate calculus that is not so connected to what happens in the US?
I think it probably presents a few opportunities for Australia. The IRA sucked a lot of international capital away from countries like Australia to the United States because of the huge tax credits and opportunities that came with that piece of legislation. If elements of that are repealed, then I think that international capital, and there is a lot of it looking for safe havens in the climate space, that's an opportunity for Australia to see that investment coming into Australia. So I think we need to be ready for that. That means putting in place policies that give certainty. Investors will spend their money if they are certain about the returns that they can get, if they're certain about the playing field. And I think that's a big opportunity for Australia.
That's interesting. Good to know that there's some silver linings, even with things that might look negative at an initial blush on climate action. Just going back to COP29, there's certainly a key role for Australia in the discussions they're focused on there, setting up the financing for developing countries to be able to take climate action to be funded by developed countries. The Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen is obviously playing a key role in helping lead some of those talks, but it sounds like it's been very difficult to get a consensus. There's plenty of reporting that the Saudis are among those that are disrupting the progress of some of these negotiations. You did say that you thought the sentiment was very positive in general, but in specific terms, do you think they will be able to land a consensus position that progresses this really important issue of climate finance?
Well, I wasn't involved in those negotiations, and they've been ongoing since I've left the COP. But what I will say is that we met with the delegations of over 20 countries. All those countries were as enthusiastic as any time that I've met with them in the past. And I've been to, this is my third COP, previously as a minister in the New South Wales government, last year as an opposition figure in the New South Wales Parliament, and this year now as the Climate Change Authority. And whether it be Korea, South Africa, the UK, all of the messaging from those countries was we're going to continue on the trajectory of strong action on climate change. Now, there is a nuance to that. Each of them did say to me that they would wait and see what would happen under the Trump administration. So certainly in the case of Korea and South Africa, they said they still intend on having a robust 2035 target. They still intend on driving momentum when it comes to action on climate change and decarbonising their economies. But they did want to take their time to make sure that what they were doing wasn't going to be impacted by decisions of the Trump administration.
And what about Australia? Do we need to wait and see? Do we need to sit back before we make decisions about, say, our 2035 targets?
I think the first thing that we need to do is the work that the current Climate Change Authority is doing, and that is making sure that we have a clear view on what the science says is required to do our bit to limit global warming. I mean, we're seeing the effects of climate change are not something that's going to happen in the future. We're seeing it happening right now, both at home with bushfires, floods, droughts. ocean warming events, and abroad. We saw, a hurricane in the United States, which caused $50 billion worth of damage only a couple of weeks ago. We saw the worst floods Spain has ever seen. So this is not something having an impact in the distant future. This is happening right now. So we need to understand the science and what Australia's obligations are to ensure that we limit carbon emissions into the atmosphere. But we also need to understand what is achievable. And I think that's a huge body of work which we're currently undertaking. I've just come to your studio today after spending all morning from 8 till 1:30 meeting with stakeholders that will be impacted by decisions of the Climate Authority, trying to understand what is achievable, what technologies are available, what's possible for those businesses. I want to ensure that we protect our planet and hand it to our kids better than we found it, but do so in a way that grows our economy and leaves us more prosperous as a nation.
There's what's feasible for what we can achieve and what our emissions reductions might be. There's also what's feasible in terms of the overall global target of limiting global warming. Is it still feasible for Australia to be looking at a 2035 target that still tries to make sure we do our bit to reducing global warming to a 1.5 degree rise?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the message I got from other countries as well, that we can still do something about climate change if we take strong and decisive action, if we move as far and as fast as possible, as soon as possible, we can absolutely do our bit to limit global warming to safe limits. Now, it's going to be a big task, particularly in the absence of American leadership for a short period of time, but we're seeing a lot of green shoots around the world. I mean, look at China, for example. In the first 3 months of this year, they installed 60 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity in their electricity system. That's bigger than the entire Australian electricity system alone. By the end of the year, for 1 year alone, they will have installed an entire capacity of India's energy system in just renewables. So the momentum continues, notwithstanding what happens in the White House. And the point that I want to make to your listeners is that, action to deliver a clean and safe environment by taking action on climate change is bigger than one election cycle in one country. And that's the message that I got out of COP.
Well, I want to ask you about a different election cycle, and that's the one here in Australia. Certainly, the Labor government has previously promised to deliver a 2035 target by the end of February. The Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, and Chris Bowen have both now said that there needs to be a little more time taken to assess these global changes, and it's not entirely clear when we'll get those. In fact, Tanya Plibersek said in Parliament that she's waiting on the Climate Change Authority to offer its advice because it's legislatively required to. How long will it take the Climate Change Authority to do its work and provide advice to the government?
We're working as hard as we can, and we're looking to deliver the advice as soon as possible, but it's a huge undertaking. We're pretty comfortable with what the science requires us to do. Now we're going through the hard and rigorous process of understanding what is actually technically possible. How far can we push renewables into the grid at this stage? What can we do in the industry part of the economy to help displace carbon emitting sources of heat, for example, in a way that continues their economic growth. We're meeting extensively with stakeholders. We're working with modelling agencies to understand the economics of the different types of technologies and how they can be deployed at scale. And one of the things that I will say, Mel, is that the concern I have around the Inflation Reduction Act being repealed is that a lot of the technologies that are potential pathways for Australia to decarbonise aggressively may be not seeing the level of capital investment or government support that we were previously hoping might happen that would assist Australian efforts to decarbonise. So we need to...
So a lot to assess and a lot of moving parts. Does that preclude being able to give the government advice by February?
Well, no, we're going to work as hard and as fast as we can to provide independent, rigorous advice to the government of the day and to the people of Australia. I mean, I'm an independent...
we couldn't put a time frame on it by any chance.
Well, no, we couldn't, because this is a huge body of work, and I need to be able to stand up in front of the Australian public and say, this is what I recommend in terms of ensuring that we protect our planet, but is in the national economic interests as well. And that's a big body of work. There's a diverse range of stakeholders. There's a diverse range of technologies. We're working through that process, and we'll be ready to provide our advice when it's robust, when it's evidence-based, and that I can justify it to the Australian public.
And how do you ensure that your climate change authority's position and need to do this rigorous work isn't used by a government of the day, maybe Labor today, but a government even at another time, as a delaying strategy? Is the fact that the Climate Change Authority hasn't provided its advice to a government of the day, is that a reason for a government not to be clear about what its general intentions are?
Well, I can't speak for the government of the day or the opposition or any of the political parties that will put forward policies on these things. But what I can speak for is the independent, fact-based, evidence-based advice that the Climate Authority will provide. That will be based on the science, that will be based on the technical, engineering and economic evidence. We'll do the work necessary to ensure that what we put forward to the Australian public is robust and that they can have confidence in the fact that it will do its bit for the planet and do its bit to strengthen the Australian economy.
And as you say, this is a huge body of work. I'm presuming it's not going to be factoring in nuclear power as part of the equation. If there was a change of government, would the Climate Change Authority need to go back and reassess its advice based on a very different policy being offered from a different side of politics?
No, because what we're focused on is moving as far and as fast as possible to limit carbon emissions going into the atmosphere. And anyone with a basic understanding of carbon budgets knows that the sooner we can remove carbon from the atmosphere or from going into the atmosphere, the better chance we will have of avoiding catastrophic global warming. And the idea of waiting 20 years until nuclear is available, when there are plenty of other technologies that can ensure that we have a reliable and affordable electricity system, means that you are essentially blowing your carbon budgets, destroying the environment, and just only serving the purpose of propping up vested interests. And that's not something that is going to do the job. We're in the business of providing fact-based, evidence-based advice on how we can limit global warming. And people talking about nuclear in the Australian context, saying that we should go from coal to nuclear, are basically blowing the carbon budgets, trashing the environment and leaving us worse off.
I just want to ask you one last question. I know that you obviously have this body of work to do and you're not going to have a suggestion of an emissions reduction figure for 2035 for us today, unfortunately. But we do know that other bodies have been looking at this, just as the Climate Change Authority has as well. And I note a recent report from the Climate Work Centre which notes that the work that is being done at a state and territory level is quite significant and could see an emissions reduction by as much as 71% by 2035 based on state and territory action alone, aside from what the Commonwealth is doing. Without asking you to, deliver any specific figures, do you think it's fair to say that there is a lot of work being done at other jurisdictional levels that means a Commonwealth government can afford to be ambitious when it is looking at the next 5 years of its targets?
Well, I think each of the state and territory jurisdictions have mapped their own path to net zero by 2050. I was proud as the Liberal Energy Minister and Climate Minister to have legislated a 70% emissions reduction target by 2035. That was in a coalition government. I know that the Victorian government, Lily D'Ambrosio, legislated a 75% emissions reduction target in Victoria. And I think I saw those numbers in today's paper from Climate Works that say, if you just combine the efforts of all the states and territories, you get to about 71%, I think it was. That Climate Works piece of work I'm looking forward to getting. I want to see the detail underpinning their assumptions and test it against the work that the CSIRO is doing. But this is one example of the work the rigorous work that we're doing at the Climate Change Authority. We're engaging deeply with stakeholders right across industry. I think we met with the Minerals Council this morning, just as we met with the World Wildlife Fund and the Australian Conservation Foundation, understanding where they're coming from and testing that input from industry and key stakeholders against the assumptions that we're using to underwrite the advice that we provide the government.
Look, Matt Kean, thanks for taking us through how things are looking domestically and for your insights from COP29. It's been most interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel.
And you can get in touch with us, insiders at abc.net.au, with any of your questions or suggestions. Thanks for tuning in. And David Speers will be back hosting Insiders this Sunday morning. Make sure you don't miss it. Thanks very much.